Hey all, JTC here, and welcome to patch 1.25. Fat Shark just released these patch notes and the actual patch, which is live right now, so we're going to go ahead and go over the patch notes. Regex, here are the notes for patch 1.25, which just went live on Steam. As mentioned in the comms link released earlier this week, this patch is focused on fixes for blessings and also the balance changes for weapons. Later this week, we will also be releasing a dev blog talking about changes to crafting, Sire Milk, and the Armory Exchange. As requested through feedback, this time we will be trailing a slightly different format to the patch notes with the notes sorted by class where possible. Thank you. Please let us know how you feel about this change and if you have any further feedback on our patch notes. I said it before and I'll say it again, I love how they're actually communicating with us. They need to keep communicating. The thing that's going to kill this game is if they don't release patches in a timely manner, and if they do not constantly talk to us and tell us what's coming up. So this is great. I love it. But Ogrin fixed an issue where Skullbreaker's intimidating presence was a multiplier instead of a modifier. Intimidating presence was his aura, where you gain 10% increased heavy attacks power. I don't know if this is going to be a nerf or a buff. I just know that intimidating presence wasn't working as intended, so that's going to have to be tested. Skullbreaker tweaks. Reduced the damage reduction from hard as nails per nearby knocked down or incapacitated ally from 25% down to 20%. And hard as nails now only counts allies within 20 meters. This is a pretty hefty nerf to hard as nails. Hard as nails was the feat that allowed Ogrin to gain 25% damage reduction for every single ally who was knocked down or incapacitated, which has been reduced to 20% for a max of 60, down from 75%. The biggest nerf, though, is it's no longer map-wide. It is now 20 meters. Now, I don't know if that's going to count dead allies. If it counts dead allies, that is a terrible, terrible change and pretty much kills the perk. If it only counts incapacitated and dead teammates are still map-wide, it's still a pretty significant nerf, but not as bad, but we're going to have to see. Fixed an issue with Raging Bull where only the second attack was empowered. It will now trigger on all melee attacks. Raging Bull was the 5% increased damage on your next melee attack for each enemy hit with your last melee attack, so that's a nice bug fix, but the damage bonus from Raging Bull is now reduced from 5 to 2.5%. So overall, this is an Ogrin nerf, and I do sincerely apologize to the all 200 Ogrin players out there. I don't necessarily agree with these Ogrin nerfs. I have reached out to Fat Shark to try to get some developer commentary and some notes as to why they felt like Ogrin needed nerfs, because in my opinion, I don't think Ogrin needed nerfs. Ogrin is not inherently a bad class. Ogrin is not a weak class. Is he the weakest out of all the other classes? Yes, but does that mean he is bad? No. The problem with Ogrin is that he feels clunky to play. And if someone feels clunky to play and is not really that fun to play, you do not want to nerf them unless that thing is so egregiously overpowered that it has to be nerfed, which Ogrin absolutely does not fall under. So hopefully I will get some commentary as to why they did choose to nerf Ogrin. Keep an eye on the comments down below. I will pin a comment if I do get some information on that. Zealot. Preacher tweaks. Increased the toughness bonus from Purify in Blood from 50 to 75%. Purify in Blood is Zealot's level 5 talent or feat that allows them to get 50% increased toughness from kill, which is now increased to 75%. For those that don't know, this is actually a pretty sizable buff because the Purify in Blood, the old Purify in Blood with 50%, put Zealot on par with toughness regen on kill to Veteran, because Veteran actually has 50%. Basically, Veteran has a free Purify in Blood by default, but now Zealot actually has something higher at 75%. So that is actually a pretty sizable buff. Reduce the toughness damage reduction from Faith Restored from 75% to 50%. This is a pretty sizable nerf, or it's not that sizable, but it is still a nerf to the Bleed Knife build. Psyker. Psyker players rejoice. Psyker has received some very, very sizable and significant buffs in this patch. I think these Psyker tweaks have moved Psyker from, a pretty good class all around to a very, very powerful powerhouse of a class. What did they change? Fixed an issue where warp charge cost would incorrectly increase when using Brain Burst, and fixed issue where psychonetic abilities sometimes would get interrupted by being stunned. Good, especially the latter. I personally have been knocked out of psychonetic abilities, so I'm happy that's been fixed. But psychonetic tweaks increased the damage bonus gain from Warp Siphon by 3% to 4% per warp charge. Warp Siphon is essentially referring to the charges that you get, or the stacks that you get when you Brain Burst. The stacks now do 4% damage instead of 3% damage, which is huge. But on top of that, Warp Siphon charges will now fall off gradually. As it worked before, if you had 4 warp charges, maximum warp charges, and the timer ran out, it would immediately drop to 0 and you would lose all of them. Now they will drop off one at a time, so from 4 to 3, from 3 to 2, to 2 to 1. That is huge. That is a quality of life tweak which I've been asking for, and many people have been asking for such a long time, and now it's finally here. On top of that, increased the damage and stagger of Brain Burst by 10%. So, what this means is, if the math has been done correctly, on Heresy, Damnation breakpoints for head popping is completely unchanged, but for Heresy, with max warp charges at 4, you can now one-shot every single elite and armored unit in the game, except for all of the Ogrin enemies, Mutant, and Poxhounds. When you add in Warp Battery to that for a maximum of 6 warp charges, you can now one-shot Hounds on Heresy. Like I said, Damnation remains unchanged as far as I'm aware, but for Heresy and below, this is a massive, massive buff to Brain Burst. And on top of that, it also staggers more. I'm not sure if it increases the stagger power of the Brain Burst to help stagger more stagger-resistant enemies, or if it staggers a little bit sooner in the animation. That we'll also have to see. Increase the damage taken from the target by the target from 15% to 25% when using cerebral lacerations. This was the talent that damaging an enemy with your Brain Burst ability causes them to take 15% damage, which is now 25% damage from any non-warp attack. That included non-warp based melee weapons and rifles and auto guns and whatnot. That is a pretty sizable buff to that talent, which actually might make it worth it to run now. And then fixed an issue where kinetic overload could target dead enemies. All in all, mainly these are buffs to Brain Burst, which people have been asking for a while, but these buffs to Brain Burst make Psyker very, very good in Heresy, especially. So I'm excited to see what this is going to exactly do for Psyker and how it's going to change how you play Psyker, but I definitely feel like Brain Burst-centric builds are now going to be a lot more viable. Veteran. Fixed an issue where counterfire didn't increase the weak spot damage by an additional 25%. This, technically, this is a bug fix, but I did not realize that the 25% increased weak spot damage from counterfire was not working properly, so because it's working properly now, this is a sizable buff. Veteran was already very good, but this is very, very powerful now. For those that don't know, counterfire was his level 30 feat, which designates scab shooters as priority targets, as well as the traitor guardsman. Killing a designated enemy refreshes counterfire, that thing. So that's going to be even better now. Fixed an issue where counterfire and sustain fire would refresh volley fire on Ogrin kills. That is supposed to be only for the bigger they are, but it was incorrectly applying to the other two, so that's good. Raised the reload speed from the Blessing speed load from 0.4 to 0.14 on the highest rarity. Good. Sharpshooter tweaks. Increased the amount of toughness replenished from exhilarating takedown and covering fire from 10% to 15%. Covering fire was killing an enemy. When you kill an enemy with a ranged attack, allies in its melee range gain now 15% increased toughness regen, and exhilarating takedown was replenishing 10% toughness regen on a ranged weak spot kill, which both are now, as I said, 15%. This is a pretty good buff for exhilarating takedown. I think it actually might make it worth using now. But for covering fire is just kind of a niche thing. I don't really see covering fire being used that much, especially considering that you have bio-optic targeting, which is just a really, really nice team-wide buff. So we'll kind of see how that goes. Increased the amount of stamina restored by duck and dive from 20 to 30%. Duck and dive was the running, sprinting, and sliding past ranged enemy attacks, or dodging ranged enemy attacks by sliding, sprinting, and dodging, replenished stamina, which is now 30%, which is actually a pretty good sizable buff. I like that. There are a bunch of different weapon changes to go over, and I'm not going to go over all of them because a lot of them are weapon or just kind of bug fixes, but we're going to go over some. Smoothed out the animations and removed the jitteriness from the Mark II columnist braced autogun, the Graya braced autogun, I butchered that name, and then the Agrippa braced autogun transitions between weapon special and hip fire. Good. It always felt a little kind of... It always felt like the recoil was like really heavily increased after you use the bash, so I'm happy that that's been fixed. Tweaked damage output from all Ripper Gun weapons against Carapace armor from 0.1 to 0.5. Now, I'm all for Ripper Gun buffs, but I'm not certain that this is actually a good buff. Don't get me wrong, an increase from 0.1 to 0.5 is great, but realistically, I don't know if this is going to actually do anything. Now, I have a pea brain when it comes to math, so I could definitely be wrong, so I would appreciate it if people in the comments below were to tell me if this is actually going to be a sizable buff, because I'm not very much a math person, but just to me, it doesn't really seem like this is going to be a pretty sizable buff for the Ripper Gun against Carapace armor specifically, and it's still going to be kind of weak against Carapace, but tell me in the comments below if I'm wrong. Tweaked the damage output of the faux rend Mark V Ripper Gun and the Mark VI Ripper Gun from 200,000 up to 250,000. That is a significant increase in damage from the Ripper Guns, and that they desperately needed, so I love to see that. And then increase the ammo count of the Mark V Ripper Gun to be in line with the Mark II and the Mark VI. Awesome. I love these Ripper Gun buffs. The Ripper Gun desperately just needed more damage across the board, and we basically got that, both against Carapace armor enemies, no matter how small that might be, as well as just a general increase in damage. So that is going to be huge and actually allow it to be a viable weapon. Changes to the Lorenz Mark V kickback, which, if I am not incorrect, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I believe that is the single-shot shotgun from Ogrin, which is going to be... These are some pretty sizable buffs for that weapon. Increased reload speed base value by 35%. Increased the damage modifier against Carapace armor from 0 to 0.5. Once more, not sure if that's actually going to be a sizable buff. Increased damage against maniac enemies from 0.9 to 1.0. Increased range cleave from 1.5 to 2.5. And increased ammo reserve base values by 5. And increased minimum effective range to 5 to 8 and maximum effective range from 8 to 15. This actually puts the kickback kind of like on the playing field, because originally there was no reason to ever use the kickback. It was the worst weapon in Ogrin's arsenal by far, so this actually makes it worthwhile using now. How good it's exactly going to be, I'm not certain. We're going to have to kind of play around and test that, but this at least kind of puts it on the playing field. The cleavers have gotten some pretty significant buffs as well. Mark 6 and Mark 4 cleaver stab attacks now deal increased damage to flak armor, 0.8 to 1, and carapace armor, 0.5 to 0.25. Stab attacks damage to flak, carapace, and resistant increased from 1 to 1.1. Increase the sweep speed on the Mark 4 cleaver, second heavy attack by 30%. Chain time into second heavy from other actions is decreased by 0.15. Now, I'm not certain. I do know that there was one specific cleaver for Ogrin that was actually pretty good, while the other two really fell behind. I'm not sure off the top of my head which one of those cleavers was the really good one. It might be the Mark IV, in which case the slight nerf to the chain time is perfectly fine. But other than that, these are some pretty good buffs for the cleavers. I do know the cleavers, except that one specific one that I don't remember off the top of my head. The cleavers were underperforming pretty much in general. They kind of felt like hitting enemies with wet noodles. So these are some pretty good buffs as well. Increased the Mark I Bully Club second heavy attack sweep speed increased by 30%, and chain time into it from other actions is decreased by... Oh, okay. I'm just kidding. It's decreased. Okay, just kidding. That's not a nerf. That's a buff. So, sorry, I read that as increased for some reason. So, actually, those are some pretty significant buffs to both the Bully Club as well as all of the cleavers. Holy shit. Okay. That's awesome. Ogrin desperately needs weapon buffs. There was pretty much no weapons that were viable for Ogrin other than the single-shot grenade launcher, the shield, as well as the power maul. Those were basically the only options you had. Maybe you could justify heavy stubber, but other than those, you really had no other options for Ogrin. So I love seeing these Ogrin buffs because, oh my god, he desperately needs it. My poor baby boy. tweaked the Mark IV Assault Chain Axe so that the first heavy attack is slightly more horizontal so you can cleave through more enemies. Beautiful. And then, guys, rejoice. The Headhunter autoguns have received so many buffs that is actually going to make them worthwhile using. I'm so excited. Raised damage versus flak armored enemies from 0.75 to 1, and raised damage versus unyielding enemies from 0.75 to 1.0. Toned down the horizontal recoil and made all 3 rifles easier to handle. That was the number one thing that made all of the Headhunter autoguns unusable, in my opinion, was the insane amount of recoil that they all had for some reason. And the fact that it's been toned down now is actually going to make them like a pretty good sniper weapon, in my opinion. Right now, the really only sniper-esque weapon we have is the Mark 12 las gun, but if the recoil is actually toned down a significant amount, these are actually going to kind of replace the Mark 12 las gun as the sniper weapon. So I'm actually really, really excited to see how they're going to work specifically on Veteran. Raised impact for the Agrippa Headhunter autogun from 9 to 15, increased the average clip size for the Mark III autogun and the Mark VII autogun to 40, and increased the average clip size for the Mark VI Headhunter autogun to 30. So across the board, it's mainly just kind of an uptime increase. Uptime buff. Recoil buff, as well as a buff against damage versus flak armored and unyielding enemies, which is where those weapons struggled most. So I'm excited to see how exactly this is going to affect these weapons, but like I said, I'm expecting these to actually not take the place, now that I think about it, not take the place of the Mark 12 as the sniper, but allow them to start competing with it, which is huge. Increased damage and impact to heavy attacks with the Mark IV Assault Chain Axe and allowed it to damage one more target while cleaving. Assault Chain Axe, in my opinion, might actually be the worst weapon in this game right now. That's not an Ogrin weapon, so any Assault Chain Axe buff that can help with its horde clear, I am going to welcome. The only thing that I'm not seeing with the Assault Chain Axe is that the Assault Chain Axe has this kind of weird thing where every single time you hit an enemy with it, your Assault Chain Axe gets locked into that enemy and like starts sawing through them, which is cool, but the problem is it's very disorienting and jarring because it snaps your camera to that enemy and locks you to looking at them, which if you're looking in different directions or flinging your mouse around, it's very like jarring to just have your camera be snapping 24/7 constantly, like left, right, left, right, left, right. So I wish they would have done something about that, but otherwise, these are great buffs. Fixed instances with the Mark VI Cleaver, the Mark IV Cleaver, and the Mark III Grenadier Gauntlet, where on certain attacks you can miss an enemy with a swing when standing extremely close to them. I know that has happened to me one time, so I'm happy that's been fixed. And then finally, they increased the Mark V kickback damage range from 850 to 1150 to 900 to 1350. Fixed an issue where Kuros with stamina perks would apply +1 instead of the correct amount. I was not aware that was bugged. That's awesome. And then the last thing I wanted to cover, tweaks to scab shooters. Scab shooters actually got nerfed across the board, which I'm actually very surprised about. Reduced damage from shots by 20%, increased the base aim duration before shot to 0.3 to 0.5, which is scaled down by difficulty, and increased base cooldown after shot to 2.25 to 2.75, up from 2.0 to 2.5. So some actually pretty sizable nerfs to scab shooters just pretty much across the board. I do know that scab shooters were the more deadly option for ranged enemies because they fired more frequently than the Trader Guardsmen, but that they actually brought them like back pretty hard. I'm not certain if the the reduced damage from ranged shots is actually going to be too much and is going to make them a little bit trivial, but that's once more something we're just going to have to see. There are a couple of other bug fixes and tweaks to patch 1.25, but I'm going to let you guys read those on your own for the sake of time. Overall, I think these are some fantastic changes that we've been asking for a long time. Once more, I'm not certain how I feel about the Ogrin nerfs, but other than that, I love this patch and I love what Fat Shark is doing with the game so far. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below if you agree, disagree, and I will see you guys next time. Peace, y'all.